I read The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading all of the Cosmere stories in their published order. So expect spoilers for everything that has come before this, which includes almost all of the Stormlight Archive, all of Mistborn that is available now, eras 1 and 2, because this is the ending of era 2. Pretty much all of the short stories, the graphic novel White Sand, standalone novels like Elantris and Warbreaker. So it's all up for grabs. I don't have a script. I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but I will probably bring up parts of all of those books, so watch out for the spoilers. So here we've got the fourth book in Era 2, which closes out this kind of 1800s period of cowboys in the Wild Wild West with magical metal powers. And several years have happened since the previous novel, in which Marcy and Wayne have become work partners at the constabulary. And so they are like co-detectives going out on the cases and stuff into the city to solve crimes. Wax has retreated from that kind of work and become a senator, with Steris kind of backing him up and working to make bill proposals and all of that kind of thing, while the two of them have also been building a family, and now they have a son whose name is Max, and he's a little boy in the story. And tensions in the basin have continued to deteriorate with the surrounding cities, and things are tense with the Malwish from the southern continent as well. And the mystery of what's going on with Trell and autonomy has not been resolved in all of this time. And in this book, the prologue starts off with Wayne instead of Wax, which I think indicates to us in the story that Wayne is going to be a more central character instead of a supporting character. And actually, I think that he is the central hero of the novel, and that Wax kind of takes a little bit of a back seat to him at the end of everything, which is actually kind of cool, because I think that Wayne's heroism is due in part to the work that Wax has done in his life of helping to rehabilitate him. And so the way that Wayne becomes a hero in the story is kind of down to Wax. And so there's a way in which they kind of built each other up, sort of what I was talking about with the previous book in the Stormlight Archive, how we are built by the people around us, and that we're not like these atomized individuals who exist as an island, but instead our relationships are kind of what cause our identity to come into being. And so Wayne's heroism is due to his relationship with Marcy, his relationship with Wax. And so Wax has been the hero of the story for the last 3 books. And there's a way in which his legacy is Wayne's heroism, is kind of what I'm saying. But in this prologue, we see Wayne as a little boy while his mother is still alive, and the kind of innocence and sweetness of him, but also that mischievous edge to him that it seems like has always been there and is a kind of fundamental part of his personality. And his mother tells him a bedtime story, and it's the last story that she ever tells Wayne. And then the next day she goes off to her job at the mines and ends up dying in a collapse. And so this story becomes a part of the way that Wayne sees the ending of his own story and his own life throughout this novel. He's kind of reading the world symbolically through the story that his mother told him about Alamancer Jack, and how he hunted down some criminals who tried to run away. Because in this story, we're going to finally hunt down the Set and discover their relationship with Trell, who is an avatar of the Shard of Autonomy, and figure out how all of that relates to each other and the threat on Ellendale and the tensions with the surrounding community, and how all of these mysteries for all of the books have been related, and we're going to, track them down to their source and neutralize them. Like the other books, this one operates as a detective story. And just like in any detective story, the detective gets hired early in the story. And once again, God comes knocking on Wax's door and hires him to do a job. And so Wax has kind of given up this life of a detective to become a senator and try to affect good on a systemic level in society and try to ease the tensions between the Ellendale society and the Malwish, and also with the surrounding communities of the Roughs and all of the basin communities that are not part of the Ellendale city. And he's trying to make a society that's more fair and equitable for everyone, but it's pretty difficult. People are really pig-headed about their factions that they're a part of. And so he ends up getting called away to the nearby town of Bilming by Harmony to investigate. That is where the set is, that is where Trell is, that is where his sister is, and it's going to reveal what have been going on for the entire story. I think the major theme of this book, kind of the thing that's going on underneath the surface symbolically, has to do with personal transformation, the way in which we change as people, and how that change is characterized as a good thing in the story. And it really requires that you have read all 4 books and that you're comparing where the characters end up, where they are, even at the beginning of the book, compared to where they were in the first book. So if you think about Wax, he was a guy who was running away from his past in the first book of the Second Era. He was trying to get out of law enforcement and get into the kind of basin politics and be a good High Lord. He was even going so far as to arrange a marriage that, had nothing to do with love or companionship. And at the end of that story, even though he gets pulled back into being a detective and a constable, crime fighting and all of that kind of stuff, it feels like he made an emotionally kind of failure choice in choosing Steris over Marasi, that there was something kind of cowardly about it, that Marasi was exciting, that she was a person who was interested in the same things that he was, and that Steris is this kind of cold fish who is boring and alien and weird, and she's never going to be able to meet Wax where he is as a person, because he goes out into these extreme situations. He's defying death all the time. He's kind of living on the edge. And Steris is just this hyper careful person who avoids danger at all times and is most excited by doing taxes and things like that, right? So they seem like a total mismatch. It seems like the wrong move to build his household around this person. But once you get to this book, you see that there's a really genuine love connection between them. Their family has a really beautiful dynamic to it where they're all supportive of each other. And the way that Wax and Steris are opposites is actually complementary instead of being some kind of dysfunction in their relationship, and that they kind of fill in the gaps for each other, and that they have a real affection and appreciation for each other that is the foundation of their relationship, instead of being the thing that is holding them back from connection. I think this speaks to the very structure of how Scadrial has been calibrated ever since the first book of the First Era, where there's this theme of push and pull, where everything has its opposite, and how when we're thinking about the push, we need to be thinking about the pull at the same time to understand the full picture. And so the relationship between Wax and Steris is one of completeness because of their oppositeness and the way that they're so different from how they were in the first book is an achievement rather than some kind of personal failure to maintain their integrity and like quote unquote be who they really are or something like that. I think so often in stories, there's something heroic that, is essential to the characters that has to do with them sticking by who they are despite, all the trials and travails that the plot throws at them, and that a kind of integrity and continuity to their personhood is seen as a virtue, and that to change or to compromise in some way is a failure. But I think this story, more than any other Mistborn story, emphasizes the way that the characters have changed, and because of those changes, they find success and are able to finally bring an end to the conspiracy that's threatening their world. The Wax from the first Era 2 book would never be able to do the things that the Wax in this book is capable of, and that's because of how much he's changed along the way. There's one point in the story where he's kind of leaping through the air, doing his steel pushes, and he's in the city. I think he's chasing down a criminal. This is early in the book. And he does a cool move where he like pushes himself up into a building. He lands on a balcony. He runs through the building itself on the interior and jumps off the other side, and then lands in the street in front of the criminal and then, knocks him out with a punch or something. And he thinks about how this maneuver would have been just totally impossible when he was in the roughs, and how much he appreciates and loves his ability to move around in the city, and how the modernization of everything has, contributed even more metal to the world. And there's like the wires running through the walls, and he can see and appreciate the energy moving through the world, and it gives him a greater context for everything around him. He can kind of tell the shape of things just by burning his metal and looking around him, in other words. And so he's come into a deep appreciation of the city instead of the contempt that he had for it in the first book, and using it as a refuge to run away from the pain of the roughs. Now this place is his home. He finds it beautiful in its own right. He appreciates the things that it makes him capable of as a protector. And furthermore, in that moment, he thinks about his freedom from his feelings of guilt and pain that he had in the past, that he's grown beyond them, and that he has a kind of meta appreciation for his new life and his happiness with his family, with Steris and Max. And so he appreciates the way that he has changed. He has this kind of meta appreciation, like I said. And I think that's like the real signal for me when I was reading the book, that like, oh, this is a big part of what this novel is about, is that these people have changed, and that change represents a good thing. It's not some kind of moral failure to be themselves or be authentic in some way. That change itself is a marker of authenticity and goodness in the story. Because part of the reason why God gets in contact with Wax in the first place is because by holding these opposing powers of ruin and preservation, he's become deadlocked into total inaction. The powers won't allow him to do anything that favors preservation over ruin or ruin over preservation. He has to find ways to act that include both of these things simultaneously, and those kind of paradoxical actions will either, produce results that have nothing to show for them, or run counter to his goals of protecting his world from being invaded by autonomy. And so there's a way in which harmony has completely stagnated and is no longer able to change, but the main characters of the story are dynamic and changeable, which allows them to have agency in this crisis and be able to solve the problem where harmony is not able to contribute anything at all. And this gets back to actually the larger theme that emerged out of White Sand and what we saw of Autonomy herself in that story, how power belongs to people who do not possess authority, actually, and who the way to accumulate a kind of clean power and authority, if you will, is to unblock the capillary passages of mistrust that exist between those with power and those without, between those in authority and the common people who ratify their position. Because the people in White Sand who follow Kenton were able to give him their loyalty and contribute to his political power because he demonstrated the ways in which he's trustworthy and the ways that he was making his institution of the Sandmaster's DM more accountable to the people and to the council that it was accountable to. And so by being more transparent, by having a more honest and open relationship with the other institutions, those institutions had the freedom to choose to give their loyalty and power to Kenton, which is what, led to his success by the end of the story. We see a similar kind of thing in this story where Harmony and Autonomy are both frozen in states of inaction, because if they intervene in what's going on, it's going to go against the intention of the shard that is in possession of their will. And so in Autonomy's case, she can't reach into things and just help out Telson, Wax's sister, because if she does, then Telson failed to be autonomous and gain her own power. It was a deus ex machina. She got bailed out by the power of God, and therefore that undermines her ability to be an avatar of Autonomy. And then Harmony can't do anything because he's being pulled in two directions simultaneously. And so in both cases, being extremely powerful is no good because you're trapped by the parameters of the power itself. And so these disempowered characters who seem like they, shouldn't have the ability to confront gods or do things that gods cannot, are in fact far more powerful than these cosmic beings that they're interacting with, merely because they have, less responsibility, less constraints on their actions than the gods do. That lack of constraint directly contributes to their ability to change. And for the main characters, it's that ability to change that gives them the edge in the fight, because Telson has become frozen in her ambitions and plans for the basin. Since the previous book, she's been trying to come up with this bomb, basically an atomic bomb or an investiture bomb that's going to destroy Elendel and kind of deliver supremacy to her. But she's not, in coming up with this complicated plan that's going to blow up Elendel, she's fully committed all of her resources to accomplishing that thing, and it's taking years. In all of those years, she can't afford to change anything because that would disrupt and derail the plan, and she'd have to come up with a new plan. And so the other characters get to change and evolve and become something new in the meantime. And so once her plan goes into effect, her enemies have become completely different people. And so all of her attempts to stop them are based in the past, in who they were, instead of who they have become. And therefore, they're inefficient in terms of stopping her enemies. And so in the case of Wax and Wayne, she engineers these assassins whose job it is to mirror Wax and Wayne in powers. And then she tells them that, you're going to have to become Wax and Wayne. They kind of hold your position in the world, if you will. And to fully become yourselves, you're going to have to eliminate them kind of like a doppelganger problem that, if there was someone who looked and acted and thought just like you out in the world, then they would come to displace you. And the two of you would have to fight until there is only one, like Highlander or something. It reminds me of the work of this sociologist, a French sociologist named René Girard, who has this thing that he calls mimetic theory that he claims is the origin of desire in people. And basically what it is like you learn how to desire things from the stories and archetypes that we encounter in our culture. And so as you grow up, you're kind of told or formed into what you should want. I think our most proximate experience of this kind of thing is like advertising, right? Where the ads come on and they say, you need this kind of car. When you're a child, you need this kind of toy, these kind of clothes, this kind of job, on and on like that. And that your desires are then formed by this relationship that you have to a story you're being told about what is best for you in the world. And that what ends up happening is because of mass communication, these desires are transmitted exactly the same to many, many people, but there's limited resources or limited available slots, if you will, for people to embody these kind of things. So if society tells you that the best thing of all would be to become the president of your country, well, there's only one person who can be president at a time, right? And there are way too many people for everyone to take a turn, which means that there's going to be competition and infighting for that singular position. Because many, many people have been sculpted into having the same kind of desire. And so many people will fight over that singular position. That's exactly what's going on with these assassins and Wax and Wayne. They've been sculpted to mirror Wax and Wayne in their abilities and to compensate for their weaknesses, and in general to be calibrated to like overwhelm and destroy them. But the thing of it is, they were calibrated to destroy Wax and Wayne from who they were in book 1, not who they are here in book 4. And so now Wayne has kind of gotten past his fear of guns, his PTSD when he picks up a gun. Wax doesn't live for the thrill of solving mysteries and of putting his life into danger and having to live on the edge all the time. Instead, he's become a protector who has something more fundamental that he's working for, and he's become a little bit more conservative and thoughtful in the way that he approaches these situations. He's not so driven by this need to run away from who he is. He's much more comfortable with who he is. And because of all that, Wax and Wayne are able to overcome these mimetic copies of them who are competing to be who they are. Because the fact of the matter is, they're not competing to be who they are. They're competing to be who they were. And that's not something that either Wax or Wayne is interested in being anymore. I think for Wayne, he's changed into the kind of person who has become more self-aware about why he is reaching for other personalities, why he is able to approach everyone equally with a kind of radical empathy and impersonate anyone. And the reason is because he's been running away from himself. He's been trying to avoid his own shame. He sees all people as being equal because all people are equally not him, if that makes any sense. All of them are available for him to kind of step into the shoes of, because being in his own shoes is not desirable. He's not a good person. He's the kind of person who shoots somebody's father and robs them of their family. But now Wayne has been around long enough that he's starting to become aware of these things. He's starting to listen to the advice of his friends, and it's harder and harder for him to live in this bubble of self-punishment and avoidance for confronting who he is. It gets back to the theme that I was talking about in the Stormlight Archive of forgiveness versus restitution. That Wayne's behavior has paid back the heinous thing that he did when he tried to rob a man and ended up shooting him, and that he robbed that man's family of their father and traumatized the children for the rest of their life. Maybe that's the kind of thing that you can't really pay back, but Wayne has taken responsibility for that family and has paid the expenses of the man's children ever since then. He has worked as a lawman ever since then to put an end to crime, to protect regular people from the kind of criminal that he was in the past. And while he feels like this doesn't make up for it, there's a way in which he's not the same man anymore. And given the same opportunity now that he took when he was a young man, he would never try to rob that person. He would never shoot that person in cold blood. The fact is that he has become someone different than he was. But Wayne's idea of himself is still held in that it's frozen in that same position of the young man, who shot a man in cold blood. And so he still thinks of himself as that person, and it doesn't make sense to him when his friends tell him that he's a good man now and he has nothing to be forgiven for, that he has kind of earned his way or paid his way out of being that man. And another way of saying all that is simply Wayne has changed. And so when he's fighting against the little chaos gremlin person, who is supposed to be his doppelganger, it doesn't represent who he has become. And when Wax and Wayne find success against this assassin pair, it's because they stop trying to fight what used to be themselves and fighting over this position that actually neither Wax or Wayne wants to occupy anymore, but instead defending and protecting each other. That's where they find their success, because that's who they have become over this time. They've stopped, on the one hand, with Wax being the person who runs away from his problems, and for Wayne being the person who makes a joke out of all of his problems, into two men who protect the innocent and who fight for justice. And so once they trade off and fight against each other's doppelgangers and protect each other, that's when they find success, because that is who they have become in the story at this point. It's kind of the same thing with Steris, right? When we see her in the first book, she's this cold fish. She is characterized in a way that's extremely unattractive emotionally to us as the reader. She seems like the wrong fit for Wax, and just kind of like an alien presence in the story that just seems like the totally wrong way to go. But at this point in the story, all of her little quirks are very endearing. They're extremely valuable. Again and again, Wax and Wayne find success because of Steris's careful forethought and her consideration of packing them food, packing them ammunition, and all of the contingencies that she thinks of. And ultimately, she's able to save the city of Ellendale because in her spare time, she thinks through these catastrophic scenarios and has, completely planned out a way to neutralize them. And so that's not exactly something different than who she was in the first book, but now she's been loved in this relationship by Wax and appreciated for being like that, which has given her the confidence to present those plans to the governor and to find out that what she considers to be her kind of shameful, freakish behavior that puts her outside of society is actually the thing that saves the city itself. It's the most valuable thing about her, and it's the thing that finds her place, her vocation in society. And so Steris is just as much of a hero as Marasi, Wax, or Wayne in the story. She saves millions of people and, preserves civilization because she evacuates the city with no casualties or injuries. That's not something that Steris from book one ever could have accomplished. She never would have had the confidence to step forward. The way that she would have approached the governor would have been this facsimile of, like this built up version of what she considered to be an acceptable version of herself that came off so awkward and inauthentically that it's off-putting to the people around her. And so the governor never would have listened to her. I think we see this the most of all in Marasi in the story. And she has a really beautiful conclusion to her arc, I think. And it's really wonderfully contrasted by the character of Moonlight in the story. Moonlight is obviously shy from the Emperor's soul. And so she has joined the Ghost Bloods. And we have a character from the world of Elantris who's here on Scadrial. And she's able to use her soul stamp magic in all kinds of creative ways to pursue the agenda of protecting Scadrial from autonomy. And Marasi is entranced by this, figure of high adventure who is involved in a kind of systemic protection and change that appeals to her. Like, think about Marasi from the first book. This is exactly the kind of person and organization and work that she was aspiring to do in the first book. She wanted to change the entire world with the kind of, laws and vision that she had for the society. And now here are the Ghost Bloods, a group of people who are working for the greater good that answer to no one and who can influence the very rules of reality itself when you're looking at someone like Moonlight. And so she kind of idolized Wax and Wayne because of their heroic adventures. Well, here's a whole institution that is comprised of these kind of superhero personas from all across the Cosmere. And they are asking her to join with them. That's exactly the kind of thing that Marasi from book one would have done. But now she has experienced success within her own career. She's gained the trust and approval of her peers and the constabulary. They don't resent her for kind of jumping through the ranks ahead of herself. They see her emphasis and commitment to the rights of prisoners and the kind of systemic change that she wants to make as being a part of the larger project of law keeping in general. And everybody admires her for the work that she's managed to accomplish in her career. In other words, she doesn't need the approval of these heroes anymore to define who she is. She's gotten the accolades and earned her way into the position of respect that she now inhabits. And so while these characters are really cool and speak to something, nostalgic inside of Marasi, they don't move her in the same way that they would have in the first book, I think. And furthermore, Marasi, through her work, has come to recognize that, in the first book, she had this real top-down approach to the way that effective change was going to be implemented, that she was going to make these big changes about, the broken windows theory and things like that, and that this would produce safer neighborhoods and just systemically change people in ways that they weren't even conscious of because the larger structure above them had been affected first. And what Marasi has come to understand is this thing that we've been talking about since White Sand, that at the end of the story, she says that her power comes from the people, that is the origin of her authority. And so for her to join an organization that is accountable to no one, that bases its power in secrecy would be the exact opposite of what she considers to be good. Now Marcy sees that true change isn't affected from the top down, it's affected from the bottom up, and that the people themselves need to ratify the decisions of their leaders by investing the power of the people into those leaders. They need to be chosen by the people. They need to be supported by the people so that the people can be led to a more prosperous and successful future. This is the exact opposite of what autonomy is trying to accomplish in the society, right? Where there's this kind of fake individuality where everything is exactly the same. Like, here are dozens and dozens of houses that all look the same, but you've been sold that this is the thing that you should desire in that exact Girardian way that I was talking about earlier with the mimetic kind of desire formation. That's a top-down approach to managing people where the authority is being pressed upon the masses. Marcy wants to do something that's more like community activism, a grassroots from the bottom-up approach, where she empowers the people to choose the leaders who will best affect the change that they are already invested in. That's a different version of Marcy than we met in the first book. Someone who is unsure of herself, but sure of her ideas about how leadership operated. Now, with the experience of years, she trusts in the people and she feels a responsibility to maintain that relationship that she has with the people and protecting it from this organization that is accountable to no one. And when you examine how Moonlight's story ends, she radically becomes a completely different person, but in a way that forgoes this kind of transformative effect and instead does this kind of magical leaping over the barrier, right? She rewrites her past to become an Elantrian, and it fundamentally changes who she is completely. And it's almost like an act of suicide. And that her individualism is utterly synthetic in that moment. She's not really that person at all. She's just kind of magically been forced into that shape, that configuration by way of the investiture. And so there's something kind of startling and grotesque about the way that Moonlight transforms at the end of the story when you compare it to where Marcy lands in her relationships with the Ghostbloods. We also get, complete textual confirmation in this story that Kelsier is the leader of the Ghostbloods, and it makes a lot of sense when we examine what the goals of the Ghostbloods are, right? That they want to protect Scadrial at all costs, that they have this kind of utilitarian philosophy to them, that the ends justify the means. And this is a red flag, for all of the Cosmere stories that we've read. This is the behavior of bad people when the ends justify the means. And Marcy points out to them that the reason I can't join you is because the way that we do things is as important as the goals that we have and want to accomplish. So I can't be the kind of person that I need to be if I'm going to be part of this secret organization. And so even though the Ghostbloods, participate in the heroism of this story, I think if we've been paying attention to the entire Cosmere story up to this point, we should have really heavy doubts about, their moral place in the Cosmere. They are highly compromised by this attitude of the ends justify the means. And it maintains that kind of ambiguity that Kelsier has always had from his first appearance in the first book of Mistborn. But it is interesting to contrast him with Sazed at this point, in both of their careers, because Sazed is utterly frozen and stagnated in his role as a god, where Kelsier is very dynamic and changeable and goal-driven. It feels like Sazed is getting to a real breaking point, and some kind of crisis is going to emerge in the next stage of the Mistborn, era that has to do with containing or maybe even eliminating Sazed as this god of two powers simultaneously. And on the other hand, to get into the villainous characters, you have Telsin, who has really become arrested in her development and hasn't changed, and instead has been invested by this being of autonomy and given these powers. But at the same time, there's a way in which that has taken away something of her individuality. It's kind of frozen her into doing the same thing for all these years and kind of spinning her wheels and getting nowhere. They managed to develop this catastrophic bomb, but they don't crack the technology necessary to deliver it from Bilming to Elendel, a kind of intercontinental ballistic missile technology that they don't figure out. And so she ends up using the Navy instead and sending the bomb as like a dead man switch situation. And so they just kind of aim it at the destination, and then boom, everything is going to be done. And Autonomy's forces are getting ready to come through Shadesmar, or the cognitive realm, whatever you want to call it. And they're going to take over the world. But that means that this path that Telsin is committed to has kind of isolated her from all of the other characters in her life. And so her goals are no longer evolving and changing, or her personality is no longer dynamic. And so by being frozen, it makes her weak and brittle compared to the more pliable and living characters, the heroes who confront her. And I think if we're just talking about individuality, there's nobody in the story who greater embodies individuality than that hero that we're focusing in on, of Wayne, who, he's so funny and, the comic relief and everything, but also kind of bittersweet and tragic in this book because we get under his skin and see all of the vulnerabilities there. But nobody sees the world the way that Wayne does, right? Nobody approaches things like Wayne does. There's nobody as singular as Wayne in the story. And so he truly embodies autonomy and individuality in the story in a way that Telsin fails to. Because in a lot of ways, she's just a person who's trying to enforce a mass conformity for people. And you can see this in the experiment that they have running, where they kidnapped all of these allomancers in the first book and put them through this kind of pseudo-apocalyptic event. And now they live in an underground bunker where they watch these people and are hoping for them to breed together and maybe produce a Mistborn or Twinborn or whatever. Their community is arrested at the technological level that was happening in the first book. And so the rest of the world has moved on. They have indoor plumbing, indoor electricity. Everybody has hot water, indoor bathrooms. There's automobiles all over the place. There's telegraphs. And the set has even started to innovate movies and things like that. And this community that's underground is like stuck a decade in the past during one of the periods of greatest dynamic transformation that's happened in the entire history of the world. And so it shows how there's a frozenness to this idea of autonomy and being cut off from others that leads to stagnation, that leads to failure. And even within its own context, they try to freeze the world at this point where, it's the same world that it was when they were kidnapped from the surface world. And they believe that, the surface world is gone and that they live in this post-apocalypse and this is the best that they can manage. But they themselves don't become frozen tools of the set. It reminds me a lot of the first era, especially of the first book of Mistborn, where you had the Lord Ruler and his society was constructed in a way that was not for people, but for kind of tools. He wanted to instrumentalize all of the people in his empire. and have them like cogs in a machine, right? But the people are dynamic and they have needs and they evolve and they change. And the system that the Lord Ruler had was frozen and couldn't account for that. And so in this underground society, the set has constructed a place that is frozen and isn't dynamic. It's not set up for change. These people who were so selfish and corrupt that were part of the elite noble set in the first book have become these people who are compassionately reaching out to the surface level where they believe the victims of the apocalypse live, and they're trying to invite them down into their society to create a better, more integrated, more fair society where everybody lives together. And they're willing to overthrow their leader in order to accomplish this goal. So that's a totally different, they've completely transformed from who they were in the first book to become, this active, vibrant, compassionate community of inclusivity that is trying to wipe out corruption of their leaders. And so it shows how this frozen society model that the set is trying to impose on them fails to account for the dynamism that people intrinsically have built into them. And I think that's where the failure of autonomy in the story lies, that the person who is the most individualistic is Wayne, and he is the most malleable, changeable, intermeshed, empathetic character in the story. And his heroism comes from all of that, right? The way that his empathy includes everyone, the way that his method of seeing the world is so different than the top-down autocratic version of autonomy's world. And so I think at the end of the story, what characterized heroism and good and evil at the end of Era 1 had to do with this willingness to take power when it's available and to use it to affect the change that society needed and to defend the defenseless, to survive in the face of ruin, and to preserve the world by kind of reconciling the paradoxes that we are as people, that we are not just one thing, that we are many things simultaneously, and we contain these kind of bursting energies of contradiction, that when we accept that about ourselves, then we can become something new and the world can be reborn when we become large enough to embody that. And at the end of Era 2, I think heroism is characterized by this willingness to, once you've taken the power, like where do you go from there? Once you've taken the responsibility to protect society and to help society to evolve and become better and more successful, what is heroism after that? This evolves things, and that evolution is the core part of where the heroism is. It's this willingness to change. It's this willingness to become what is necessary and to be moved by the people around you and the things that happen to you. And that the being trapped in the authority, just to retain the power, actually misses the point of what the power is. The power actually lies with the people. It lies with everyone. And leadership, therefore, has to come from the bottom up. And the seizing of power is not this kind of dominance like the Lord Ruler had, or this assimilation of contradictory powers like Sazed did at the end of Era 1. Instead, it's a willingness to change to become what the people need and to protect them against the forces that are trying to destroy them. And so I think, the goodness in Era 1 is that we must take the power when it is available to us in order to do good. And in Era 2, it's that we must become protectors with the power and be willing to change. And the way that we're guided in that change is by trying to do our best at every moment. And that will help us to use the power that we've taken to create a more successful and equitable society. And so I don't think that Sanderson is just repeating himself. We see these two fully closed eras of the Mistborn story. It's hard for us to compare to the Stormlight Archive because we haven't even completed the first set of the Stormlight Archive. But when you compare and contrast Era 1 and Era 2, I think what hopefully you can see is that Sanderson is iterating on what happened in Era 1 instead of merely referencing or doing some kind of nostalgic retelling of the first era. He's evolving it, he's changing it. And that is, a risky artistic and commercial choice, but I think it authentically represents something about the real world back to us. And at least for me, it feels very rewarding to get to this point in the story and kind of reflect on everything that we've gone through in the Cosmere and the things that are being held up to us as heroic values and goodness. It's not about staying the same all the time or standing your ground, but about being willing to be someone new, which takes a lot more courage and is way more difficult, I think, than just burrowing down and kind of burying your head in the sand. And so we're going to move on from Mistborn into some of the more standalone novels that are going to explore the edges of the Cosmere and some different kind of storytelling where we get a different kind of more embodied and deliberate narrator instead of this kind of omniscient third-person, close third point of view perspective. We're going to be living inside of the head of Hoyd or Wit, with Tress of the Emerald Sea being in the next book. So it's going to be very interesting to get to see some of the different magic systems that are out there in the world and explore a different style of storytelling.